Most people assume that this imagined future exists because they are dissatisfied with the present. But dissatisfaction is often the symptom rather than the cause. Long before a person consciously begins imagining who they will become, the nervous system has already learned to organize itself around elsewhere. Attention becomes directional before it becomes conceptual. The future self is simply the story consciousness invents to justify a movement that had already begun. You can see it in ordinary moments once you begin looking. Someone sits with a meal while already imagining the healthier version of themselves who will eventually eat correctly. They exercise while measuring themselves against a body that does not yet exist. They meditate while waiting to become someone who no longer struggles with distraction. Even rest becomes another investment into a psychological tomorrow rather than participation in the only life that is actually unfolding. Notice how subtle this becomes. The activity itself is not the problem. Exercise is not postponement. Meditation is not postponement. Learning, healing, creating, building, none of these naturally divide you from the present. What separates you is the identity that quietly stands between who is here and who is expected to arrive. The action remains present, while the meaning of the action quietly migrates into the future. This changes the emotional texture of everything you do. Every success becomes evidence that you are approaching someone. Every failure becomes evidence that you are falling behind someone. Progress itself begins carrying anxiety because it no longer exists for its own sake. It exists as transportation toward an imagined identity that continually moves farther away the closer you believe you are getting. This explains why many people feel strangely empty after accomplishing goals they believed would change everything. The goal was real. The accomplishment happened. The celebration was sincere. Yet the identity that was supposed to finally arrive never actually appears. Consciousness simply manufactures another version waiting somewhere farther ahead. The horizon quietly relocates while convincing you it has remained exactly where it always was. Psychologically, this creates a life that is always beginning but never arriving. There is always one more lesson before living, one more breakthrough before relaxing, one more achievement before belonging, one more relationship before becoming whole. The mind mistakes preparation for participation because participation without preparation feels frightening to an identity that survives by postponement. Many people describe this as perfectionism, but perfection is often only the visible behavior. Beneath it lives something more fundamental. The future self provides psychological permission to avoid fully inhabiting the present version of yourself. As long as fulfillment belongs to tomorrow, today's incompleteness feels justified. Delay begins masquerading as responsibility. There is an unexpected comfort hidden inside this arrangement. If the person you need to become always exists ahead of you, then you never have to completely meet the person you already are. You can remain in relationship with possibility instead of reality. Possibility is infinitely editable. Reality requires direct encounter. One can always be improved in imagination, while the other asks only to be seen without negotiation. That is why the future self often feels safer than the present self. The imagined version cannot disappoint you because it never actually exists. It cannot contradict your expectations because you are continually writing its dialogue. It remains perfectly available for projection. The present self, however, is alive. It contains uncertainty, contradiction, limitation, beauty, exhaustion, creativity, confusion, wisdom, and unfinished movement all at once. Reality refuses the simplicity that imagination prefers. This becomes especially important on any path of inner development. The language may change, but the structure often remains identical. Someone begins chasing higher consciousness instead of professional success. They begin seeking awakening instead of achievement. They begin collecting spiritual experiences instead of material accomplishments. From the outside, everything appears transformed. Internally, the architecture has barely changed. Tomorrow has simply learned a more sacred vocabulary. The mind is remarkably adaptive in protecting its own continuity. Remove one identity and it often replaces it before you notice the absence. Release the successful self and the enlightened self quietly appears. Release the wounded self and the healed self begins demanding loyalty. Release the seeker and the teacher arrives asking to be maintained. Consciousness can repaint the walls of the prison without ever questioning why it continues building rooms. This is why identity deaths rarely feel dramatic from the inside. They often appear almost disappointingly ordinary. A sentence loses its emotional charge. A familiar ambition becomes strangely quiet. A conversation you would once have rehearsed endlessly simply dissolves before reaching your attention. Nothing spectacular announces the shift. The machinery simply stops receiving the energy it once depended upon. People sometimes mistake this quietness for losing motivation. In reality, they are encountering motivation that no longer depends upon psychological distance. Action begins emerging from participation instead of compensation. You still create, but creation no longer attempts to complete you. You still learn, but learning no longer serves an identity that requires improvement in order to deserve existence. Growth continues, yet it no longer functions as evidence that you are becoming real. This distinction changes almost everything. When growth arises naturally, each moment contains its own completion, even while remaining unfinished. A tree does not postpone being a tree until it reaches its final height. A conversation does not become meaningful only after its final sentence. Music is not waiting for its last note before it begins existing. Movement and completeness are not opposites unless thought insists they must be. Perhaps this is why so many people unknowingly fear the death of the future self. Without it, they wonder what will generate movement. If there is nowhere psychologically better to arrive, why continue evolving at all? The question feels reasonable because almost every form of motivation they have known has depended upon becoming someone else. They have rarely experienced action arising from direct participation rather than imagined deficiency. Yet observe children before identity becomes heavily organized around achievement. They learn because life is interesting. They move because movement is natural. They ask questions because curiosity expands them rather than because answers improve them. Development unfolds continuously without requiring a psychological promise that fulfillment will finally occur later. Growth and presence exist together because they have not yet been separated into competing destinations. Perhaps maturity is not the endless refinement of the future self, but the gradual disappearance of the need for one. Not because life stops unfolding, but because unfolding no longer requires an imagined version of yourself standing somewhere ahead as its justification. When that imagined witness begins losing its authority, something unexpectedly simple starts revealing itself, and the entire relationship between time, identity, and becoming quietly begins to reorganize. The future self survives because it quietly becomes the observer of your entire life. Every experience is evaluated according to whether it moves you closer to or farther from the person you believe you are becoming. Reality is no longer allowed to simply be experienced. It must first pass through the judgment of an identity that does not actually exist. Without noticing it, you begin asking tomorrow for permission to feel today. This creates an exhausting relationship with ordinary existence. A peaceful afternoon cannot simply be peaceful. It becomes productive or unproductive. A conversation cannot simply be intimate. It becomes helpful or distracting. Silence becomes either spiritual practice or wasted opportunity. Every moment is forced to defend its value before an imagined future audience that never stops demanding evidence that your life is progressing. Notice what this does to attention itself. Instead of resting where experience is happening, awareness repeatedly leaves the living moment to compare it with an internal projection. You are physically present, but psychologically elsewhere. The body sits in one room while identity keeps traveling into another. Eventually, this movement becomes so familiar that it no longer feels like movement at all. It simply feels like thinking. The The remarkable thing is that consciousness rarely questions this habit because comparison creates the sensation of control. If tomorrow can be imagined clearly enough, perhaps uncertainty can finally be managed. If the future self can be perfected, perhaps today's vulnerability will disappear. The mind begins negotiating with uncertainty through imagination, forgetting that imagination has never possessed the authority it claims. This is why anticipation often feels more emotionally powerful than direct experience. Before an event, consciousness can arrange infinite possibilities. During the event, reality inevitably refuses those arrangements. The imagined relationship, career, awakening, conversation, or breakthrough always contains less friction than the living version. The future self is continually constructed from ideal conditions, while the present self must actually inhabit imperfect circumstances. Eventually, this creates a subtle resentment toward reality itself, not because reality is especially difficult, but because reality continually interrupts imagination. Every unexpected delay becomes an obstacle to the future identity. Every mistake feels larger than it actually is because it threatens the storyline of becoming. Life is no longer unfolding, it is interfering. This helps explain why some people become increasingly anxious as they become increasingly successful. Achievement removes excuses, but leaves the mechanism untouched. When one future arrives, another immediately replaces it. The emotional pattern remains intact because the structure was never built from lack of accomplishment. It was built from identification with psychological distance itself. The destination changes while the movement survives. What finally begins dissolving the structure is not abandoning vision or refusing to plan. Human beings naturally imagine possibilities. We naturally prepare, create, organize, and dream. None of this needs to disappear. What begins disappearing is the emotional dependence upon imagination as the source of identity. Vision remains useful after it stops becoming personal. There is a profound difference between planning tomorrow and psychologically living there. Planning finishes and returns. It serves the present before dissolving back into it. Psychological projection never returns. It quietly relocates your center of gravity into a place that cannot be inhabited. One supports participation. The other continually postpones it. You can feel this difference almost immediately if you observe carefully enough. Imagine preparing for an important conversation. In one state, you consider what matters, gather your thoughts, then allow yourself to arrive when the moment comes. In the other, you rehearse endlessly, replay imagined responses, defend yourself against conversations that have never happened, and leave emotionally exhausted before anyone has spoken. The activity appears similar from the outside. Internally, they emerge from entirely different relationships with time. Most suffering generated by the future self does not come from the future. It comes from rehearsing realities that never become real. Consciousness spends enormous amounts of emotional energy preparing for experiences that dissolve the moment life unfolds differently. Entire emotional worlds are built around events that never arrive. The body carries the weight of imaginary history as though it were memory. Perhaps this is why presence often feels strangely empty at first. When the future self begins losing influence, consciousness temporarily loses the familiar occupation of constant anticipation. Many people mistake this quietness for boredom. Others mistake it for a lack of ambition. What they are actually encountering is attention without its habitual destination. The silence feels unfamiliar because identity had learned to measure itself through movement toward elsewhere. For a while, this can even feel disorienting. Without a future version continually evaluating experience, decisions seem less dramatic. Small failures lose some of their emotional intensity. Success becomes strangely lighter. Ordinary moments stop demanding interpretation. It is not that life becomes less meaningful. Meaning begins arising from direct participation rather than constant comparison. This changes your relationship with growth in a way that initially seems almost paradoxical. You often become more capable precisely because capability is no longer carrying the burden of becoming someone. Learning accelerates when it stops proving worth. Creativity deepens when it stops manufacturing identity. Love expands when it no longer promises completion. Action becomes cleaner because it is no longer entangled with psychological self-construction. There is another consequence that many people do not expect. Gratitude begins changing its character. Before, gratitude was often directed toward what would eventually happen. You were grateful in advance for the person you hope to become. Now gratitude begins attaching itself to what is already unfolding, not because everything is pleasant, but because reality no longer needs to become something else before participation feels possible. Appreciation shifts from expectation to encounter. This is the quiet death that often goes unnoticed. The future self is not defeated through discipline, argument, or force. It slowly loses relevance because consciousness no longer requires an imagined witness to validate existence. Tomorrow continues arriving exactly as it always has, but it is no longer carrying the responsibility of completing you. And when tomorrow is finally released from that impossible burden, something about today begins revealing a depth that had been hidden beneath the constant effort of becoming, inviting an even deeper examination of what identity has been protecting all along. The death of the future self is not the end of direction. It is the end of psychological dependence upon direction. These are not the same movement. One asks where life wishes to unfold, the other asks where identity hopes to escape itself. From the outside, they often appear identical. Internally, they arise from completely different relationships with existence. When identity is driving, every decision secretly asks, who will this make me? Even generosity becomes reputation. Curiosity becomes self-improvement. Love becomes completion. Presence becomes another technique to master. The action may look beautiful, but beneath it, consciousness is still bargaining with itself. When participation begins replacing identity, something unexpectedly quiet happens. Questions lose their urgency without losing their importance. Decisions remain meaningful without becoming personal. You still care deeply, but your caring is no longer trying to manufacture a better version of yourself. The energy once spent constructing identity quietly returns to simply living. Many people mistake this for becoming passive because they have only known action powered by insufficiency. If I no longer believe I must become someone, why would I continue creating? Why continue learning? Why continue serving? Yet this question reveals how completely becoming had replaced being. It assumes movement requires psychological incompleteness. Look carefully at life itself. Rivers do not flow because they are trying to become rivers. Trees do not grow because they feel inadequate as saplings. Conversations unfold because each sentence naturally gives rise to the next. Movement is not evidence of deficiency. Movement is one of the ways life expresses its completeness. Perhaps this is the deepest misunderstanding hidden beneath personal development. We have imagined that wholeness would eliminate growth. In reality, wholeness transforms the source from which growth emerges. Before, growth attempted to repair identity. Now growth becomes the natural consequence of direct relationship with reality. One grows because reality is alive, not because the self is broken. Notice how differently mistakes begin functioning from this place. Before, every mistake threatened the future self. It became evidence that you were falling behind your own imagined timeline. Shame naturally followed because identity had become invested in uninterrupted progress. Every failure appeared larger than the event itself because it endangered the person you hoped one day to become. Without that psychological investment, mistakes become strangely ordinary. They still matter, they still carry consequence, they still invite learning and responsibility, but they no longer rewrite your existence. An error becomes information rather than identity. Correction becomes participation rather than self-repair. This is why humility begins appearing without effort. It no longer needs to be practiced because there is less psychological territory left to defend. You can admit uncertainty because uncertainty is no longer interpreted as incompleteness. You can change your mind because consistency is no longer protecting a self-image. You can listen because you are no longer secretly preparing tomorrow's version of yourself while someone else is speaking today. Even memory begins changing its role. The past no longer exists primarily as an explanation for who you are becoming. It becomes part of the living movement that brought you here without requiring you to continue carrying it as identity. Gratitude naturally appears because nothing has to be erased. The previous versions of yourself are no longer prisons to escape or trophies to preserve. They become seasons that were never meant to last forever. The same becomes true of the future. Planning remains, vision remains, responsibility remains. You still schedule tomorrow's meeting. You still save for coming years. You still plant trees whose shade you may never sit beneath. But none of these require psychologically relocating your life into tomorrow. Time becomes something you relate with rather than somewhere you live. This reveals something surprisingly simple. The future self was never waiting for you because there was never anyone there to meet. Every moment you imagined finally arriving, life was quietly continuing exactly where you already stood. The distance existed only as an organizational principle inside consciousness. Reality itself never participated in that separation. Perhaps this explains why genuine presence often feels less dramatic than people expect. There are no fireworks announcing that you have finally entered your life. No permanent emotional high proving that you have arrived. The extraordinary quality of presence is almost disappointingly ordinary. You answer the phone. You wash the dishes. You grieve. You laugh. You work. You rest. Yet something fundamental has changed because none of these moments are being treated as transportation towards somewhere else. From the outside, others may notice very little. They may still see someone pursuing meaningful work, setting goals, caring deeply, showing discipline, learning new skills, and evolving through experience. But internally, the architecture has been quietly rebuilt. Action is no longer attempting to justify existence. Existence has become the place from which action naturally unfolds. The visible life may appear similar, while the invisible relationship to living has become entirely different. This is why the death of the future self is not actually about the future at all. It is about reclaiming the authority that had been unconsciously given away. For years, perhaps decades, an imagined tomorrow silently judged every experience, every decision, every emotion, and every possibility. Now that authority returns to direct participation. Life is no longer interpreted primarily through comparison, but through contact. And perhaps this is what every identity death has been quietly preparing from the beginning. Not the construction of a more refined self, but the gradual discovery that awareness does not need another version of itself in order to fully inhabit what is already here. The identities fall away one by one, not because they were enemies, but because each eventually completes the work it was capable of doing. What remains is not emptiness, but an intimacy with life that was impossible while consciousness kept negotiating with an imaginary tomorrow. Then a different kind of question begins appearing. Not who will I become? Not even who am I? But something quieter, something that cannot be answered once and carried forever. What does it mean to participate so completely in this moment that no imagined version of myself is needed to witness it? Every spiral eventually returns here, because this question is not asking for another identity. It is asking whether awareness is finally willing to live without one.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.